Hello, welcome everyone. It's nice to see so many participants in our second session of our virtual speaker series. My name is Susie Kennedy and I'm representing our health mission here at APL, and I'm here to welcome you and kick off the event. So the objective for our series is to bring together partners in the community to explore the role of AI in health through real world applications. And I'm really excited about today's agenda. Dr. El-Zerad will tell us about his experiences with AI and therapeutic development with a focus on policy implications. And then after that, we'll have a 30-minute panel discussion and then followed by a question and answer session. And so be prepared for a really great and thought-provoking discussion. So how to participate? So we want this to be interactive. So everyone should go ahead and log into Slido. So go to sli.do and enter the event code that's shown there. And that's really super easy. That'll get you into this event. And then you can enter any questions that you'd like our moderators to ask. And you can vote up for your favorite questions. And then our panel moderators will use those questions and the most popular of those questions in the panel discussion. So that's how you participate today. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Khair El-Zerad. Dr. El-Zerad leads the development, coordination, and implementation of medical policy programs and strategic initiatives for the FDA. Prior to joining the FDA, he served as acting director of the Clinical and Healthcare Research Policy Division for the Office of Science Policy at NIH. And there he worked on policies related to human subject protections, the design, conduct, and oversight of clinical research, and enhancing quality assurance programs at pharmaceutical development and production facilities. He currently leads multiple projects focused on exploring the potential utility of real-world evidence, innovative clinical trial designs, and the integration of technological advances in pharmaceutical development. He earned his doctorate degree in medical sciences with a focus on cancer and metastases from the University of South Alabama, and he's also earned a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. So with that introduction, welcome, Dr. El-Zerad.
Thank you so much, Susie, and thanks for everybody for the invitation and for attending today's talk. I really appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion with you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my slide very quickly with everybody. Thank you, Susie, for the wonderful introduction. And in addition to what you said, part of the fun part in my Office of Medical Policy, is that we anticipate innovations, we anticipate advancements in technology and therapeutic development, and we try to think, how our regulatory frameworks can handle such innovations to prepare us as an agency to make sure that we facilitate such development. Before I start, this is the title of my talk, and I used exponential technologies for the first time. And for disclosure, this actually came from a Deloitte paper on manufacturing. I've always struggled with using the term digital age because I felt like the digitization really happened a lot earlier than we think. Exponential technologies highlight that the convergence of technologies that's happening at our time that could result in exponential, not necessarily linear, advancement in production and innovation, and also in cost reduction. With that, you see my disclaimer there, and then let's dive in. So for today, we're gonna go over a few things that in the end is gonna promise to touch on AI and technology in general, but we're gonna start discussing the evolving ecosystem around us. And again, I'm giving you the perspective from a regulation and from a policy-specific perspective around regulation. And I'm going to highlight the need for innovation. I hope I can convince you why we need to really start thinking across the board of how can we do better in general. And then I'm going to highlight the FDA Real World Evidence Program, which is, I think it's a very important program and highlights where technology is needed as well to make sure all available data is utilized. So within that, I'm going to mention real-world data, including EHR, electronic health records, claims, digital capture, etc. But I'm going to focus on EHR because of the time limitation of the day. We're going to discuss a little bit of study designs outside of just the typical randomized clinical trials, and I'm including in that observational studies, decentralized clinical trials. And then we're going to go into technology and the role of technology as I think is a key moving forward. And this is where we're going to explore the potential use of technologies and digitization. And then from there, I'm going to take a subset of that, which is the focus on AI. And I hope we can have a very interesting discussion on AI. And I look forward to hearing your perspective on it as well. We'll end up with a couple of things about collective learning. I'll be amiss if we did not mention the situation with the current pandemic, for example, and what we learned from that. And then some take-home message, and we'll open it up for discussion. So quickly going over the rapidly evolving ecosystem. So this is all like very interactive area. We know there are multiple streams of evidence, multiple stream of data that's relevant to health and relevant to the function of therapeutics that I think we should consider collectively for healthcare and for research and regulation as well. And this is highlighted today by my discussion on the real world evidence program that I'm going to mention a lot of those streams of data that are relevant. This is also aligned with the increased utility of digitization and technology in general. And it's across the board, from telehealth to the use of health chat functions to the use of AI, and a lot of sensors that we're seeing over and over again. And of course, everybody's aware of the smartwatch and their capabilities right now around atrial fibrillation and beyond. And also, I'm going to touch on the innovative clinical trial designs and innovative study designs in general. Some of this are areas that's already been discussed for the last 10 years. I think we're seeing the actualization of them happening now, and I think it's a very exciting time, including that decentralized clinical trials. And those are trials that can be done at home, and you can utilize tools for those, such as phones, tablets, etc. And of course, adaptive clinical trials and complex innovative trial designs as well. This is some of the stuff we'll touch on. And the arrows highlight that this is really all interactive. None of this is exclusive. I think advancement and successes in one area will lend itself to other areas as well. So forgive me for those who are aware of this figure, because this is, I think, is an overused figure to show how, for drug development in general, how long the process is, and it takes 10 to 15 years in general. And you start usually with thousands of compounds, promising compounds, and you end up with one drug, hopefully approved drug, after many years. The other thing I want you to take from this, in addition to the length of time, is the post-marketing. This is the area that you see in the very right side in the dark yellow. This is an area where you can see how the drug is working, or how the therapeutic is working in real life for years potentially after it's been on the market, and how it's interacting with the heterogeneous populations and how it's been utilized within healthcare settings. And this is a very interesting area because real-world evidence is a very important aspect of looking at how post-marketing information can be utilized moving forward. Also, ASPE produced a report a few years ago that it was a really interesting report showing the cost of clinical development per therapeutic area. And you didn't have to read everything here, but the idea is you can see how the cost of clinical development, phase 1, 2, and 3, and beyond, it could be in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So the cost and the time obviously involved in all this therapeutic development, and it behooves us really to start thinking, how can we do better here? How can we utilize technology, utilize analytics to move this schema forward? So that's why I thought that those who drafted the 21st Century Cures Act had an insight around the utility of real-world data. And as you see here, this is directly from the Act itself. It's required the FDA to establish a program to evaluate the potential use of real-world data. We're going to discuss what are this real-world data and real-world evidence. And then this is specifically for the approval of new indication for a drug approved under Section 505C, which is once the drug is approved, how another indication can be added after that, utilizing this real-world data, and to satisfy post-approval requirements. Some drugs are required to have post-approval studies to provide additional information on safety and efficacy, and that can be helped by the utility of real-world data, real-world evidence. So the program is based on a framework that was published in December 2018, and it's available publicly. I'll provide links to that in the end. It describes priority areas, challenges, opportunities, and also some pilot programs, and I'm going to mention some of those that we have. And ultimately, we need to provide a guidance on real-world evidence by the end of 2021. So that's the parameters around the 21st Century Cures Act, one of the triggers, if you would, for the real-world evidence program. So what do we mean when we talk about real-world data and real-world evidence? As many of you are aware, the gold standard to generate evidence for therapeutic development is typically randomized clinical trials. You're going to hear that RCTs are the gold standard, and they remain so. Outside of that, a lot of data is generated outside of clinical research, outside of the typical research environment. And those can be a lot of what you see in the graph here: insurance claims, EHR registries, both disease and therapeutic registries, lab results, hospital records, and many others, I would say, including digital captures using digital sensors, for example. Our real-world evidence program defined real-world data as data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. So hopefully, how can we utilize this data to inform regulation and to inform healthcare in general? Of course, all these processes are augmented, guided, and facilitated by technology and analytics, and I hope I can show you some examples of that. The distinction I want to make here too is that data doesn't necessarily mean evidence. You might have a lot of data, and we're going to discuss how this data is fragmented, not necessarily well structured. How to make sense of this data is a challenging thing to provide evidence ultimately, and to make this transition is going to require us to utilize a lot of innovative study designs. This including randomized clinical trials, including trial with pragmatic elements. Decentralized clinical trials, and also a lot of very powerful analytical and informatics tool, leveraging, of course, AI, the cloud, digital linkages between different data sets, and ultimately statistical modeling as well, among many other things. And hopefully that will lead to the development of what we call real-world evidence that can be utilized to support decision-making. And it's defined in our framework as the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from the analysis of real-world data. So I hope I made that distinction clear here. Before I go, I want to highlight the issue of transparency and documentation, which is a theme you'll see in my talk quite a bit. And I think this is a challenging thing. When you think of randomized clinical trial, we have clinicaltrials.gov. You can register there. You can have a protocol there. And the prospective nature of randomized clinical trials lend themselves out to be very well laid out before the trial is conducted. Now, for a lot of real-world data, as you see here, those data are generated retrospectively at time and not necessarily within the context of research. So what do we mean, and how can we really define transparency and documentations for this kind of studies and data? So one major illustration of the struggles we have, and I think the challenge we have, is this saying by Mark Twain: in the real world, nothing happens at the right place and the right time. Take that in contrast of randomized clinical trials, when we define actually, when we capture the data, how you're going to apply the medication, and everything is well laid out, compared to what we have in the real world. So obviously, our real-world evidence in response to that have to be multifaceted, and you'll see the link below. And it has multi-aspects to it, the real-world evidence program that the agency has, including issuing of guidance, of course, engaging stakeholders across the board, and reviewing proposals that include real-world evidence utility, and then conduct demonstration projects. I'm going to show you some of that. But at the core of our real-world evidence program, the considerations for how we evaluate real-world evidence is really whether the real-world data that used to produce that evidence is fit for use, and whether the trial or study design that was used to generate the real-world evidence can provide adequate scientific evidence to answer or help answer regulatory questions, and whether the study conduct meets FDA regulatory requirements. And as you see in the diagram to the left, really the overarching issue here over all of this is data standards and implementation. So we need to come to an understanding how to utilize how to standardize this data in a way that makes it useful for us. And that's something I'm going to highlight. And hopefully the technology can help us actually in this area among many others. So how do we get there? To use AHR as an example, the good news is now approximately 96% of hospitals are utilizing electronic healthcare records, which is a main source, if you would, of real-world data. The bad news, and a lot of you, especially on the clinic side, they know the struggles with the EHR systems and their burden, especially on those providing healthcare. The other struggle is that in reality, we have over 700 vendors, for those systems, and routinely the system do not talk to each other, resulting in medical experts having to exchange data sometimes via fax or CD-ROM. I think it won't be long before when you say the word fax or CD-ROM, people want to look at you like, what do you mean? So, and then it's also critical or time-sensitive information gets routinely buried in the endless scrolls of data and those menus in EHR system. So that's definitely a struggle, and let's explore that further. But before that, the Office of the National Coordinator, in an attempt to actually, I think, address the interoperability aspect, is producing a lot of interesting work, and I want to direct you a little bit to reading on their latest initiative around the 21st Century Cures Act that's aimed at improving the interoperability of EHR, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit later as well. But going on the theme with EHR, we know that at certain endpoints, which is an important aspect of how we analyze data, those include labs, pathology, imaging, or are used in clinical practice and research. And the challenge is really the curation of those unstructured or inconsistent data formats. One great example that I've heard before, that's A1C, for example. There are hundreds of ways to describe it in an EHR system. Also, the timing of the assessment in clinical practice may be variable, and only using patients who have sufficient data may create bias, as those who show up for follow-up are often different than those who do not. And I think this has lent itself to a lot of the biases that we have to be thinking about as we utilize real-world data. Clinical outcome measures for disease progression may not also be used for or consistently recorded in practice. And that's something else when we think about how to utilize this data. Certain clinical trials or certain studies might lend themselves to utilize the real-world data. Others may not, depending on the actual outcome you're measuring. Interoperability will be necessary for studies outside of a small population, including, hopefully linkages to claim and other data sources. And I think when you think of multi-site clinical trial, this is an important issue, but also think of the global stage when you have a clinical trial with sites outside of the US and multiple regions who have potentially different systems. So this is all challenges as we think of how to utilize EHR fully. So one of our collaborations is with UCSF, Dr. Laura Asserman specifically, who's working on this, I think, very innovative and insightful system called OneSource. And the idea behind it is to be able to capture quality data from multiple sources and utilize it for both research and healthcare. And you can see the diagram on the right highlighting that the multiple data sources that can feed into that system. And hopefully that system will provide that quality data. One thing that Dr. Asserman always said and resonated with me is if data is not good enough for research, it's not good enough for care. And I think that's something to think about when you capture quality data. The other project that I think is really interesting, it's MCODE, which is the Minimal Clinical Oncology Data Elements, to produce data standards around oncology specifically, to further improve the utility of EHR system. And to put that in action, to validate that, the iCare project, it's a way to translate that into real-world data that can be utilized for research. iCare stands for Integrating Clinical Trials and Real-World Endpoints. And I urge you to read on that. This project it's very interesting, and I think for oncology specifically will be a very insightful and useful project moving forward. So we talked about the data. Let's talk a little bit about the studies. And here's just an illustration of all the way from the left, when you have randomized interventional clinical trials. Some of us call them traditional clinical trials, and moving to the right, where you see the incorporation of clinical trials in healthcare settings. Those are trials with pragmatic elements, for example, in them. And then all the way to the right, where we have observational studies. Those can be retrospective or prospective. The example of that is case control and prospective cohort studies. So you can see how the utility of real-world data can benefit all of this. I know we tend to follow the most shiny thing, we want the most innovative thing, but at the same time, we have to think, how can we improve our clinical trial enterprise, right? When I was at NIH, one of the biggest struggles was the failure of clinical trials due to simply lack of recruitment or bad recruitment. And I think it behooves us to think, how can we utilize real-world data to better enroll, to better retain those patients and to prevent the failure of trials simply because of problem with recruitment. So I see a lot of usefulness for real-world data there and real-world evidence, all the way to utilizing real-world data for pragmatic settings within healthcare settings. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more, but I want to focus a little bit on observational studies, which is kind of the main aspect of what we consider real-world data, how we can utilize data from registries or patients or EHR in an effective manner. And for that, I want to highlight that we know that some studies and some analysis compared observational study results to clinical trials to see are there differences. And here's just a couple of reports that done published reports. One of them by Cochrane Library, and the other one in the published report to the left by Dr. Concato et al. Highlighting that the observational studies, results from observational studies are very similar, are aligned with randomized clinical trials. However, this comes with a lot of caveats, as you can imagine, and I like to use this letter to the editor that highlight the issue, that we know that only some observational studies are misleading, just like randomized clinical trials, but there is no one has devised a foolproof method for distinguishing those that are useful from those that are misleading. And I think this is really where we should really pay attention to and how to do better in that area and develop that shared understanding. To illustrate that further, I put here a study that used a database, and this is on the use of oral bisphosphonate, and this is a drug that treats bone density loss. And this is a study used the General Practice Research Database in the UK, and they found that the use of this drug was not significantly associated with incident of esophageal or gastric cancer. However, in the same time frame, this other study that's from BMJ looked at the same drug, and they found out actually that the risk of esophageal cancer increased with 10 or more prescription of oral bisphosphonate, and with a prescription over about 5-year period. So again, this is really it makes us think, right? Like this is studies utilizing the same data source, same very similar period of time, same drug, and with the same outcome in mind, and delivering opposing results. And that got us think, to think, how can we really understand this in the context of utilizing real-world data and real-world evidence? And how can we really track the methodologies and audit such trials? And again, that lends itself to the question, what would transparency and documentation and tracking audits look like for observational studies in general? So I hope I put the bug in your ear regarding this kind of a study design. One way we're trying to kind of shed some light on this area as FDA is our collaboration with academic groups on the duplication project. And the idea behind it is to utilize real-world data, observational data, to compare it to randomized clinical trials that were used for regulatory decision-making. And the idea is to answer, are the results comparable? And if there are differences, what are the reasons for those differences? So this is includes retrospective replication, which if approximately 40 trials, but also prospective replication. And we thought prospective is necessary to eliminate some of the bias of knowing the results of the trial before you do the analysis. So we're hoping that will also generate some result to us by this summer. So stay tuned. I think this will be an interesting thing. And I think it's replication, failed or succeeding, will be informative to us. So we'll be amiss if we did not address a little bit of the excitement around clinical trial designs. For example, how can we embed or utilize real-world data in randomized clinical trials? How can we better utilize healthcare settings, EHRs, claims to further augment randomized clinical trials? I want to move away from the concept of randomized clinical trials versus real-world evidence. I see real-world evidence as augmenting the evidence generated in randomized clinical trials, potentially another piece of the puzzle, if you would. And also the other exciting part that I feel it's very promising is the idea of utilizing decentralized clinical trials that can be conducted at home utilizing technology. Now, again, not every outcome or every disease or therapeutics lend themselves to this type of a trial, but I think nonetheless, it's really interesting and exciting potential design where technology is a centerpiece here. And I'm really excited about it from the point of view, I've always felt like those who have the chance of enrolling in clinical trials typically are around large medical centers. And I think this design will enable other populations who potentially more impacted by the disease to be part of clinical trials as well. This actually figure came from Electra Labs, who work actually on a lot of decentralized clinical trial. And for those of you who are interested, the CEO is Andy Kuravas, and she's on Twitter. And I think it's worth looking at the Electra Labs site. It's very interesting. So part of what FDA is doing to further facilitate that aspect of using digital handheld tools to facilitate clinical trials, the development of My Studies app that's available, by the way, on GitHub right now for anybody to utilize, and it can be utilized both on iOS or Android based. And the idea is to provide an environment, a safe environment to move data for clinical trials and safely and effectively with minimal software burden. And I mentioned that the secure storage environment is a feature of this app. And to give you an example where this app has been utilized is actually in the My Heart Count study that by Stanford University, where the Google Cloud is actually sponsoring the My Heart study count for the FDA, actually My Study platform, incorporating the FDA My Studies platform to enable virtual clinical study to enroll users of both Android and iOS devices. And this is so far, I think this data is actually a few months old even, they've enrolled over 60,000 people. And this is another example of where piloting such system can help us understand the feasibility and the issues potentially with conducting large-scale smartphone-based trial. So another example. The other interesting example that I used here, just one aspect of it, is this is the exploring of digital endpoints, with the endpoint for clinical trial that we make decisions around. Some of those might be generated via sensors, via trackers, etc. And here's an example of a study that looks at the nitric oxides for those with the pulmonary hypertension associated with interstitial lung disease. And they looked specifically at the vigorous physical activity, moderate to vigorous physical activity, as defined as walking, climbing stairs, yard work, and similar activities. As you see, this is very much real quality of life issues too. So they call that the MVPA, and those were underscored by benefits shown in other actigraphy parameters, and this is utilized to detect, using digital tools to detect sleep and physical activity. And this company actually worked with the FDA to finalize key elements for the pivotal phase 3 study, including the use of moderate to vigorous physical activity as a primary endpoint for approval. Another example of how we really start thinking of sensors and digital tools as part of a clinical trial. So, I hope I kind of showed you how to fully utilize the potential of real-world data. Technology is key. And I mean, when you talk about technology, it's all over, right? Like the use of virtual care or in-person care. Some of you might be familiar with Abilify MySight. A few years ago, actually, this is still on the market, where it has a tracker inside of it that communicates with a batch and your cell phone. This is a mechanism for adherence. So we're seeing some innovations. And of course, a lot of you are familiar with the Apple Health Kit. But also in the clinical trials, you start seeing more and more, for example, the use of artificial intelligence. This is AI Cure, one of the companies that utilize artificial intelligence to support adherence in clinical trials. And when you talk about sensors, you see more and more of those sensors being applied across the board to detect multiple metrics from patients. And I want to stress too that when you talk about sensor, we're not talking just about something on the body. It can be passive sensors, and this is an MIT actually article that highlights a sensor that sits on the wall but detects the movement. And you can think of the burden of having something on the body being eliminated that way. Of course, the use of AI to improve the accuracy of real-world evidence, and that's something that's been discussed. But this is just an overall, I don't want you to overwhelm a bit, I just want to show you the diversity of really everything coming together around therapeutic development, around healthcare. This is just an illustration of all these groups and entities that are working in this area that have a relevance. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that there is really an opportune time, a convergence of powerful technologies, methods, tools, and analytical capabilities that we're handling right now, and it's very promising. And it really behooves us to start thinking about it, how to augment and how to learn and educate and adapt all of those, including thinking about the human factor. As excited as we are about the technology, I think we should think about the interface with the humans. What does it really mean to the patients, to clinical trial participants? And this is what I want to kind of take you with the focus a little bit on technology and digitization. So with that said, FDA actually, I was really kind of happy to surprise when I joined the FDA to see how they were definitely thinking of digitization and how we should get ready for that. These are guidances that FDA published all the way from 2013, 2016, 2017, and 2018 around the utilization of digital format of electronic data source, electronic informed consent, electronic records and e-signature, and electronic health record, of course. And a lot of you are aware of our Center for Center for Devices, CDRH, where they published this discussion paper around AI, the regulatory framework for modification to artificial intelligence and machine learning, which I thought is really a wonderful way to engaging the community and start thinking around this area. This was published in April 2019. And there are a lot of active work streams right now going on in the agencies. For example, the use of EHR and claims data, digital health tools, decentralized clinical trials, as I mentioned before, data standards, and the utility of AI. This is all areas we're very interested in, and we have some activities around. So with that, let's focus a little bit on AI just because of the time. And I think it's really important for us, as excited as we all are about artificial intelligence and predictive algorithm in general, is to look beyond the hype a little bit. If you look at PubMed, for example, this data from January 2020, you see a lot of publications, especially in the last 4 to 5 years, around AI, utilizing AI in the title. This, of course, doesn't say much about the quality of such publications. But the question is this really translating into something impactful on the patient? And if you look at the clinical trials that utilizing at least some form of AI, you see also a similar increase in the number of those clinical trials. Again, the quality, this doesn't speak to the quality of those trials or those therapeutics. We know for sure that AI is really is increasingly impactful when it comes to drug discovery, especially in the areas like target identification, compound screening, and compound engineering. A lot of you probably heard about how an AI team, I believe it's Google DeepMind, that won the protein folding competition. And that says something, how this is an important step in the development of therapeutics, and we're seeing AI being essential to that. And if you look at reports on PubMed, there are multiple potential uses of AI. Some of them are more actionable than others, but here's a potential list of them for you to consider. So we're hoping to see more and more of this happening in early drug discovery. Also in clinical trials, like I mentioned before, I think AI can hold a great potential in helping us recruit, in helping us target certain sites, understand where our cohorts of interest are, and also in patient monitorings and beyond. So as we mentioned with the digital sensors. So I think it's very promising technology that we should be all aware of and consider moving forward. So not to divert too much from therapeutic development, but this is one of my favorite, actually, paper that's not related to drugs or even therapeutics. It was actually about Halloween costumes, and it discusses AI. This is published, I think, in 2018, a couple of years ago. What I like about it, it actually gives some really interesting example on the use of AI. And I think I don't want to read everything here, but just to take this example. This is where an algorithm was asked to sort a list of numbers with minimizing errors, and the solution it got to is like, let's erase the whole list, because that's the best way to make sure there's no error ever, So it's kind of fascinating to think about how AI functions sometimes. And then another example they gave is in 1997, an algorithm was asked to land a plane on an aircraft carrier as gently as possible, and it discovered that in a simulation it could land the plane with an extreme force, where it's actually it registers 0 force instead. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the prediction algorithm predicts the most likely outcome based on input data, not necessarily the accurate answer. And also AI may produce unpredictable or unconventional solutions. And I think this is all really something for us to think about. The second bullet here, I take it as both negative and positive, but we can discuss that further in the Q&A. I want to take us back to transparency, because I think really this is an issue. The more we see around innovation, around AI, the aspect of transparency is really essential. And I think we should really understand it better, especially that, for example, the CDRH, Center for Devices framework that they produced has some really insightful comments and descriptions in it, including, for example, how an algorithm functions in real world, and how that potentially can feed back into the way we understand and regulate such algorithms. We're talking specifically about adaptive algorithm here. And they also introduced the term good machine learning practices. A lot of you are aware we have good clinical practices, good manufacturing practices. But what does really good machine learning practices mean? And is that something we should come as a community around to understand and define better? So I think this is an important element for transparency. The other aspect, I know that we worked with the Consort and Spirit group. They consolidated standards for reporting trials. and the standard protocol items recommendation for interventional trials to have a module for AI when AI is used in the clinical trials, what aspect of AI should be described in the protocol and what aspect should be reported to a journal when you publish something on AI. I think this is just a few steps that are really important for us to define better what's transparency and documentation mean in this world, AI and technological advances. So what is needed here? I didn't mean to pontificate, but here's just a few thoughts to you just to consider. We need to understand the function that lend themselves to AI's adoption. I think we should go beyond the hype. I think some areas are very much ready where predictive algorithm and AI can be very helpful in. And we have to understand is not just applying the term AI or applying the technology is going to be the silver bullet to everything. We need to really start developing shared understanding of principles for designing AI systems, and that's include the need for benchmarking framework. You know, how would we validate, how would we qualify AI, and how to see that as part of quality continuum. And what will transparency, audit trail, validation, etc. look like for AI? And I want to highlight also the need for early engagement with regulatory agencies, and I would say with all stakeholders as well. We need a convergence of multidisciplinary expertise, where we have training and outreach programs that help us all understand this technology and how it's been impacting the therapeutic development paradigm, and how to modify business processes and staff management. And I think we should think of team. And this is not just a challenge for those who are designing AI and technological tools in the therapeutic development, but also for us as regulators as well. Like, how can we bring our expertise together to effectively regulate such technology in an efficient way, where good, promising technologies being facilitated. And understanding the ethical implication, which is, I think, is really critical aspect. You know, think with me, like if an IRB, for example, or independent review board or DMC, data management committees are ready to handle technology and to handle AI when start being incorporated in clinical studies. And of course, the human factor, I cannot stress that enough, you know, in the interface between the technology and humans, the trust aspect, the adherence, the narrative even around AI. You know, if you Google AI, you'll probably see a lot of articles where you have a Terminator picture on the first page. And I think as scientists, as a community, we should really work together in changing that narrative. And then ultimately, we need pilots to explore what those promising areas and to understand both successes and failure. I think success and failure here as equally valuable as we learn how to utilize AI, technology, and real world. And we really have to understand failure in a different context, I believe. You know, think of adaptive algorithm, for example, where failure is just part of the solution, part of the improvement. And how do we get ready for that? Transparency is really a key issue that we struggle with as a community at large. And I think this is an area worth coming together as a community to further discuss and identify what we mean by it, and just highlighting that one more time. Finally, I want to go into the lessons learned from, and we're continuing to learn actually from the current pandemic. And as many of you are aware, the FDA, in a matter of days in March, produced a guideline on clinical trial conduct during the pandemic, and it was produced, actually published in March 18th, and it was updated multiple times just to be responsive to our community. And I think this is really sets a great example of how a regulatory agency can be responsive to the needs of our community. And I think we have over 5 different updates to the guidance because of the questions we've received from the community. And we were able to be responsive. And I think if you look at this guidance, it's really interesting and exciting in a way to see like where the technology can help us, you know, and what are the lessons that we can embed to do better for our communities, for our patients, and to those impacted by this pandemic. Ultimately, we've seen examples, if you read the questions and the answers in this guidance, on remote assessment, on remote monitoring, the use of technology in all of that, and how to really identify critical processes and invest in those, how to do effective communication, and a lot of this communication have to be in a digital format, for example, between different parties to the trial. And overall, leveraging the technology and leveraging all the tools we have to make sure clinical trials are conducted with integrity and in a way that's ultimately safe to the patients and participants in those clinical trials. Our commissioner, Dr. Han, actually was asked, you know, what lessons we can carry forward from, and he actually highlighted that how we're already thinking about a lot of the solutions, but the pandemic is going to push us to move those concepts in a faster way. And he gave the example of decentralized clinical trials, and also the use of telehealth. And I think this is a very promising area that we all should move forward in. So with that, a few thoughts to leave you in. And we need to leverage novel clinical trial designs and explore the utility of a variety of data sources. And to do that effectively, we need the community at large working with us, not just clinicians, but also technologists and other groups as well. We need to develop ways to link and aggregate, clean and analyze data. As I mentioned, real-world data is multi-source and could be fragmented, lacking in structure. And I think we should start thinking about evidence in general as mosaic, as different pieces that could come together to provide a better picture. I see real-world evidence as very promising to augment evidence from clinical trials, for example, to provide us better pictures. And the post-market aspect of that is very important. And how to incorporate technological advances across the spectrum of therapeutic development and regulatory processes is really another important aspect. And again, all of us in the same boat here, so all of us have to think about this. And how to build robust collaborations and engagement to anticipate innovation and to develop a shared understanding. And I think we have to engage much more than we used to do in general as a community, and to start understanding different parts of the puzzle. And I think technology and technology firms specifically, I think it's important for us to engage, because unlike the historical pharmaceuticals where we have a clear line of communication and through the normal application process, et cetera, I think those who are developing technology tools, we need further ways to engage and to understand those tools. I think the Center for Devices at the FDA is one of the pioneers in leading the way. And I think the framework they published is a way to communicate with the community and receive input from the community. And I take that as an example for us all. And along with developing the technology, we need to address the ethics, transparency, documentation, reproducibility, communication, and education. So we should not ignore any of that. And we need to develop robust policies and regulatory frameworks capable of handling fast evolving therapeutics and development. And then in addition to developing those policies, we have to develop the processes and norms to be able to produce those policies in a responsive manner. And again, this is challenging, a challenge for the regulatory community moving forward. And with that, I want to thank, a lot of this work is done by my colleagues in the office, including my boss, Dr. Jacqueline Corrigan-Cry, Dr. Jean Concato, who are actually leading the real-world evidence program, Rose Purcell and Karen Boyd, who are leading a lot of the work around the cloud and AI, Dr. Leonard Sachs and Elizabeth Kunkowski, who are actually working on decentralized clinical trials and digital health. And with that, I will end here. And thank you very much for bearing with me through this time. Thank you.
Kara, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I look forward to discussing many aspects of it. Just as a reminder, the focus of our speaker series is about operationalizing AI in health, and Kara gave us some very concrete examples. But one important aspect of that is technology implementation and trust and acceptance by the end user and by the public. And that's something I appreciate that Kara touched upon. And we want to explore that a little bit more in this discussion. So to help me do that, I have a co-moderator. We're lucky here to have Dr. Henry Farrell with us. Henry is the SNF Agora Institute professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And he's the 2019 winner of the Friedrich Scheidel Prize for Politics and Technology, which is presented to outstanding individuals who contribute to inter and transdisciplinary projects linking politics and technology. His most recent book, which he wrote with Abraham Newman, is titled Of Privacy and Power, The Transatlantic Fight Over Freedom and Security, published by Princeton University Press. Henry, it's wonderful to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you.
Henry and I are going to kind of go back and forth and develop a discussion here with Kara, but just a reminder, we are going to be taking questions off Slido. So if you have questions, I think the code is in the chat. It's hashtag APLNHSS2. So please send us your questions. Kara, I want to start off. You mentioned the Terminator example. It resonates very strongly with me. That's been literally a part of my work. Dealing with the repercussions of that example has been a part of my work. And you acknowledge that technology is key to the real world evidence program, and there's this piece of how technology is discussed and represented, which is important. And one thing that we deal with at the lab a lot here at APL is the developer's role in how technology is communicated, not just how it's developed. And so I was wondering if we could look at one of your examples, perhaps the My Studies app seems like a good one, or maybe another one if you'd like, to talk a little bit about how was generating transparency and trust important there to get participation for people to use that? because there's obviously, I'm sure there's concerns, privacy and otherwise. And what was the role of the developers, of the people developing the tech in helping to garner that trust and transparency?
So I think this is a multifaceted area, and I think you're right to point at it. And I think it's going to require us to do a lot of work, and not just from the regulatory perspective, but as a community at large. One aspect I would say is engagement. Historically, at least, the way when I was outside of the FDA has been seen as kind of a silo a little bit. I think you can see actually that's changing a lot, and you can see how the agency is engaging with a lot of our stakeholders. We have experts going to technology shows. We have experts going to CES, for example. What you're trying to have that kind of level of communication is that you have to see the regulation as part of a quality continuum. We have to have that dialogue. And that will include also this kind of engaging via workshops, via meetings, via discussions, that's similar to what you're having right now, for example. The example I like to give, when the real world evidence program started, there was clearly a need for our stakeholders to communicate with our experts. Right? And one way they did that very effectively is by establishing the real world evidence subcommittee, which is where you bring experts from the FDA to have more of an academic setting with a stakeholder who's coming in with a project, with a proposal that's well formed. They want to kind of have this academic dialogue, like see what the agency think about, what we're worried about as regulators, and have that discussion for us to educate us as well. And on the other hand, that was actually, in my view, one of the most useful learning environment that we have. And I think we need to have more and more of that as the technology become a major aspect of something we deal with from a regulatory perspective. The other thing, and I will stop after this one, is the need for a clear pathway for transparency and documentation around studies outside of randomized clinical trials. For example, when you use AI, a predictive algorithm in a clinical trial, what element your audience, including patients here and patient advocacy group, will need to hear? And I think this is why the work of the Spirit and the Consort initiative that I mentioned is really critical. How we publish papers, how we use the narrative in those published papers. I'm a basic scientist by training originally, and I think I learned it actually at Hopkins, the value, importance of communication. Like I can tell you for hours about two receptors and a substrate, but what does it really mean to a patient reading this paper, right? And I think we owe it to explain terminology, especially around sensitive technologies, in a way that's user-friendly and in a way that reach out to our patients. And I urge everybody to start seeing, I think, and this is for us all in the clinical trial and therapeutic development, to start seeing patients and patient advocates as partners and our products as something for them too, as part of our community.
Great, thank you.
So if I can jump in with another question, which is about how you describe the way in which we had in the United States over 700 different companies, each with their own proprietary ways of formatting data, unstructured data, all of these problems, which must be incredible from the point of view of trying to figure out how to put machine learning to use on this very problematic data. And I can only imagine that the problem is worse when we start moving to international collaboration, where we have many other different data standards and many other different fights over which data and how data ought to be formatted. So I'm wondering, what kinds of ways can we try to solve these problems on the international level? Are there initiatives going? Are there ways in which machine learning could be applied?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and I think it's a continuing challenge. And you're absolutely right. I think, especially when you start thinking of multi-site clinical trials, global clinical trials, I think this is increasingly an issue that we have to tackle as a community. One way, at least in the United States, that I feel it's going to help us a little bit is the recent, actually March of 2020, Office of the National Coordinator work around the certification of EHR systems utilizing the FHIR HL7 kind of APIs. And that's way, this is just a set of standards you're probably aware of that will help us actually have the same basis, the same foundation of EHR systems that enable us to utilize APIs on top of them, allow us to modify them, and have this interoperability happening within all of those systems. So I think this is a very important step in standardizing. But I think looking at this as only standards problem is not sufficient. I think standards is a major issue, but also how can we even go further and say EHR systems are really, when you talk about electronic, right, in the name, electronic health record, electronic at least should convey some kind of flexibility, some kind of ability to utilize this data in multiple ways. We don't have that right now. How can we really rethink that? How can we start thinking maybe potentially of a new generation of EHRs? A new generation of system that enable this interoperability as built-in feature rather than something added on top of it. And I think the other aspect, I know it's not related just to EHR, but like look at observational studies, for example. The work of the International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology, ISPE, they're working on how to standardize or how to have a place to register observational studies and what format for that registration need to happen. So that's another way globally we can do something that we all have an understanding on. The last thing I will mention, we already have built-in processes to bring this global coordination. For example, the ICH, International Conference for Harmonizations, the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulator Forum, and those are already institutions that bring consistency and bring coordination to at the international level. Now, eventually, I believe they're going to have to take a little bit more of a role in helping us coordinate around the technology as well, and bring that, at least between the regulators and those who are producing this technology, some kind of a coordination and shared understanding. But long way to go still in that area.
You know, Kare, we have a question on Slido where someone had asked, how does international policy around AI safety differ from policy in the US? I think that's related to what you were just saying. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Actually, we are involved with a couple of projects at the international stage. There is the AI for Health. It's AI number 4H. Actually, if you Google it, it started. This is focus group started by the International Telecommunication Union, which is an agency within the United Nations. And then the WHO also joined the work in that. And the idea behind it is how to benchmark AI. And they're trying to bring some consensus on, like, if you have an AI tool, and they use typically the AI algorithm that diagnose retinopathy, diabetic retinopathy, as an example of that. Like, if you have multiple versions of this, how would you benchmark it? How would you get to a standard where something like that can enter actual clinical testing? So, and I can tell you one of the highlights of those meetings is the realization that developers of AI system on the technology side, they do not necessarily see or historically do not interact with regulators. And I think there's a gap of understanding there. And I think this is why the AI for Health focus group established a subgroup working on regulatory consideration. And the idea behind it is to start developing a very high-level key regulatory considerations that can be communicated to those developing AI, to have a shared understanding of what does it really mean, for example, to have an audit trail, to have a documentation around AI, to have benchmarking. So all these aspects, I think, are something that the international community are increasingly aware of. And I think we're coming together to have a better understanding on. But that's all good. I want to just leave you also with a continuing challenge, because as all of us regulators around the world, we do risk-benefit balance. So think of a scenario where you have a setting in one country, you have a single physician per 100,000 patients, compared to a setting where you have a physician for 100 patients, right? It could be the same disease, it could be the same algorithm, but the whole balance or risk-benefit balance changes here. So I think understanding that global context, understanding these issues in a multifaceted way is going to be really important, and it's going to require us all coming together. I hope that answers it a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
So I have two questions that I'd like to bring together from you, both from the Slido. One is somebody asks, what is proactively being done to handle bias in AI? Are we bringing in diverse voices to help address and improve these problems? And somebody else asks how to mend the trust relationship between communities that have been hurt and discriminated against and technology companies. And I'm wondering here, maybe in particular in these kinds of applications, we might want to wonder about the ways in which, for example, AI might be trained against data sets which might be non-representative in one way or another, and the kinds of problems that can redound from that, and how this might have consequences both from the perspective of the trust and transparency, and also the questions that we have about trying to ensure that the different voices are involved. So how do you do that in practice?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think it's a struggle that should be at the center point of a lot of our discussion. So thank you for that question, whoever asked it. I don't have a perfect answer for this, but what I can say, I think documentations and transparency is going to help us a lot in understanding where biases and identifying where biases are. I think we're always going to have those biases, and it's a matter of having a system, a way to identify those biases, and once we identify them, how to manage them. Right? So, and understanding what data sets are used as input data sets, what data sets are used for training, for example, and the issues around those data sets is going to be critical for us. And as regulatory agencies, I think the insights into those biases are very important for us in the way we evaluate those potential tools and therapeutics moving forward. I think it's the idea of standardizing the way we look at technological tools in general, and having a system to benchmark will help us go a long way in that. It will not solve the problem. I think a lot of existing databases already, we have biases incorporated in them in ways that's probably undetectable to us at this point. But I think with time, we might start detecting those biases. So this is why I really liked the Center for Devices, the framework that I've showed. You look at the actual performance in real world, and then you start feeding back that performance and evaluating it again. I think we're probably going to have to do that in a risk-based fashion, but also that should be a way to start looking at biases embedded, and where we see biases, how to correct those biases. I'm really, I don't know how many of you we've seen on Twitter recently, it was kind of a simple AI issue where you have pixelated image, and the image was actually clearly of President Obama. Like a human brain can totally make that, build that direct relationship, but then an AI system identified as a white person, so not President Obama. So the AI bias there is very clearly depending on the data sets, of course, that you're utilizing for that. And I think we increasingly going to see more and more of that. And it's really, it's a continuing work. And identifying benchmarking is going to help, identifying ways to find those issues and address them. For therapeutic development, we always say we need to identify the risk and then have a plan to manage it. And I think the same way we'll go in this area.
Kara, a little bit related to that, I guess I sometimes in our work struggle with the notion of how to balance the pros and cons of transparency at a given point. So you mentioned the biases, and some of the biases we can see it's obvious, or it can be detected in the data, and other times there's biases and we don't understand the underlying correlation that's creating the bias, right? It's very difficult. And but that doesn't mean that there won't be really compelling headlines about the technology and what's happening, and these are it's very impactful on the public. And so I think that if anything, it just puts more back on those of us who work on technology and work on these on innovation to think differently about it. And I wondered if you had ideas from your experience or any of the examples you gave about where can transparency be increased in the development and implementation process, and where, maybe do we hold till we have more information, we can create a more clear picture. It seems like a very difficult balance.
It is a very difficult balance. And I think a lot of it initially, at least, is going to have to be on a base-by-base kind of scenario, depending on the therapeutic tool that's produced. However, maybe I'll take your question a little bit in a different direction and say, uncertainty always exists. And I don't think we should mix the novelty of the tool with the directly increased risk. I think we should identify the specific risk that's involved with specific novel tool, but not necessarily assume is going to be added risks to it. Uncertainty exists right now in even the gold standards we have, right? Like in randomized clinical trials, there is a level of uncertainty. Even in basic science, we don't understand every protein-protein interaction. We make assumptions on therapeutic product based on one pathway typically that we know a little bit more about than others, but there are much more complexity to it. And I think that also goes, to technology tools and AI. For example, there was a very interesting debate in Geneva around, this is the AI for Health group meeting there, around the black box concept for AI. Like, is it acceptable? Should we have fully explanatory development per se for AI? And I personally think let's assess the risks, right? Like, certain risks and benefit might be justifiable in certain populations, and we have to understand that. We see that in oncology all the time, for example. And I think that risk benefit is going to continue while we're utilizing those tools. So today, there's no easy answer there beyond thoughtful deliberation about the technology itself.
Thank you.
So another question from Slido, which is, how do we address competing data when one study contradicts another? And I'm wondering in particular, could you talk to whether machine learning can be applied to meta-analysis in one way or another to try and help rectify these problems? What kinds of applications are there out there?
So one of the actual application that the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at the Center for Drugs, for example, looking into the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology look at a lot of adverse events reports. They have tremendous quantities of feedback on how the drugs function from a safety perspective. And they're trying to utilize algorithms and AI in general to see if they can identify trends, identify areas in those data sets that could be helpful in us moving forward, areas that we potentially do not recognize on a typical basis. As you can imagine, their challenge is massive. They're sifting through a massive amount of data, and clearly that's an area where you can see the potential for AI and use of algorithm. And the other area that I think we really need help in, and I think it's very promising, is also for clinical trials. And you see, for example, patient adherence in a clinical trial is an issue. Like when you prescribe a drug or prescribe a procedure for a patient, how to track that patient and how to make sure they're adhering to it, and how to make sure you're retaining them in a trial. That's another area where we can see an actual advancement, really hopeful. And this is just a couple of examples. However, you started the question by saying what you do in case you have two different studies, right? Like one of them is contradictory to the other. Is that one of what you started me with, or am I mixing the question?
Yes, I think it was, what if you have two studies that contradict each other? Yep.
Yes. So I think that's an interesting question from a point of view also of post-market, right? Like, let's say you made a decisions about approving a drug, and you see the FDA have a standard for evidence, substantial evidence standard, which is both legal and scientific standards, and that include data from well-designed clinical trials to make that decision, the approval decisions on or rejection decision on. Beyond that, you start seeing more and more data potentially in post-markets. And I think this is why there are requirements sometimes to have post-market studies, right? Post-market commitments to look at the performance of the drug in real life, and to make that assessment as ongoing. There are a hierarchy of evidence that I'm not going to go into it right now. To highlight the randomized clinical trials, for example, as one of the biggest, the best standards we have, and then we go below that into like all the way to meta-analysis, etc. I think there is quite a bit of methodologies around assessing that evidence, and statistics is a big part of that as well. Now, I don't want to underestimate the heterogeneity of effect. I know this is something that a lot of us think about too. Once you have a clinical trial, it's typically very well-defined population. And when a drug or a therapeutic tool enter the market, it's become available to a multitude of patients utilizing different types of drugs and having different lifestyles as well. So what would all that have an impact on how the drug perform? And I think this is why real-world data can be very informative for us moving forward into the future.
Chair, what about, we have a question on Slido about the value of understanding negative results, and you talked a lot about clinical outcomes and clinical trials and so forth, that there's been some discussion around the value of trying to understand that, and maybe it's a way of making the data go farther. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I was at the NIH specifically, there was a lot of discussions on negative results, especially around clinical trial. Like now clinical trials, a lot of clinical trials are required to register in clinicaltrials.gov. However, how many of those end up being actual reports in publications or even communicated to patients or communicated to us as the audience? And clearly the bias for positive results is there, and I think it's very visible to everybody. And I think it's really sad, and it takes us back in advancement, the fact that we do not see the failures as well, because I do honestly think both failing or succeeding clinical trials, studies like that, it will be highly beneficial to us to understand. And especially those who actually try to define better what are the reasons behind the failures, and I think that will be extremely helpful to us. While at NIH, we try to understand the reasons why clinical trials are prematurely terminated, for example. And we looked at a subset of trials that's considered failed, and a lot of those trials simply lacked recruitment procedures and strategies, So we can learn a lot, actually, in how to make things better, how to improve things from the failures that we have. So I do fully agree with that. And I think we have to collectively, potentially then National Library of Medicine and clinicaltrials.gov have a big role to play here in how we really publish results of clinical trials and make that more ubiquitous.
Yeah.
So another question from Slido is, what tools do you see are needed for the general public to understand AI better? How does this vary across different levels of technology, different levels of community education? And I wonder in particular, and this is my addition to this question, how does this affect the kinds of trust that the FDA wants to encourage in its procedures? If these are somewhat poorly understood technologies which are being applied, how do we get the public to buy into them when they're appropriate?
It's interesting. I think before even we can ask the public to buy into them per se, we need to show the value added. We need to kind of build that trust. And I think, again, that goes back to the early development point. I think having a clear way of documenting and highlighting how a tool has been developed and how issues of safety, issues of bias has been addressed, that's actually a very important start. And this is why we're hoping a regulatory consideration document, for example, can be helpful to the community who are developing AI tools in the first place. And the second aspect, I think, communicating where we mean, what our intended purposes of developing those tools, and how those tools can be impactful in a real way to the life of patients, to the life of those who are going to be impacted by the tool, is another very important aspect. At the FDA, we had actually so far few workshops that addressed the use of technology, addressed the use of AI in therapeutic developments. And I think having more and more of those public type of conferences where anybody can log in and actually listen to a developer speaking to a regulator and vice versa, and having that dialogue, and especially when it involves patients and patient advocates as well, that would be a really meaningful steps. Like I said, I was really always surprised at the gap of between those who are developing the tools and those who are regulating it, and even those who are publishing on it. We had the meeting actually for the Spirit and the Consort group on the protocol elements for AI and the publication around AI was in the University of Birmingham. And there were a lot of developers of AI and then journal editors and regulators around the table. And the concept of missing data started coming up. And it took us almost like 10 to 15 minutes to realize that those who are on the technology side have totally different understanding of missing data than those actually on the clinical side. Just to illustrate to you one simple way of where the terminology gap happened, and I think we have to start bridging that. We have to understanding this as teams, and we have again to see the patients and the improvement of the life of patients as really the core here, and how all of us can converge into that. And I think that will help us provide terminology, provide explanations that are relevant to the patients. I don't know how helpful, for example, to provide data when you're engaging with patients, for example, in numbers or in clinical values. What does that really mean, right? And this is why I think digital sensors hold a lot of value in showing how a movement can be improved, how activities can be improved, how a person movement within their house hopefully can be tracked and show that it's been improved. Climbing stairs, exercise, etc. It's just a few examples. And I think we collectively have to come to that understanding to improve the whole process.
A theme of your discussion, Care, is that the need to accelerate innovation, but maintaining standards, not compromising our standards. And we're in the midst of a pandemic now. And I'm wondering what public health emergencies, whether it's COVID-19 or Ebola or H1N1, name one, how have they changed things? How have they maybe influenced that process or had an impact on your process?
No, that's a great question. Actually, the interesting thing about the clinical trial conduct guidance that FDA produced in response to the pandemic, how to conduct clinical trials during the pandemic, it provides a lot of really interesting ways of handling clinical trials during the pandemic, and a lot of people calling those flexibilities. But if you look at them, they're all done within the current standards, within the current regulatory standard. No standards are compromised within the current regulatory authority. Everything was done within what we have right now, right? Which really begs the question: if we can do this with our current standards, current authorities, what aspect of that we can carry forward, right? And I think, to your point, that's something is really, I think, is going to change a lot of the way we do things around clinical trials in general. To give you an actual example of that, we are working right now with the International Conference for Harmonization on good clinical practice guidance, updating the current guidance for good clinical practice, called ICH E6. And we are definitely now considering technology. We're considering the digitization of consent, for example, the processes that's going to have to be digital. And how to allow for that as part of a norm and become a norm in clinical trial, right? Seeing that as a potentially facilitating clinical trials, reducing cost, accelerating the time frame. So I think this is really impactful, and a good clinical practice is just one example of where we're going to implement that. And if I have to guess, I would say moving forward into the future, we will have a lot of more examples where we're implementing those lessons.
Great. We have about 4 minutes left. Henry, I'm going to give you the floor for the last question or for any comments you'd like to make.
So there was one other question, which was about whether or not biases in AI might only increase the kinds of differences in treatment that people of color receive. And here I'm wondering whether the concern is something like how the feedback loops that you described between AI, machine learning, and policy application, how these feedback loops might perhaps have negative consequences instead of positive consequences if they're not carefully designed, and if there isn't the opportunity for some kind of outside input into their designs. So.
No, it's again a good question. Sometimes I wish. I know it's also a closed meeting, but one of the most interesting meetings is when you see our medical officers meeting and discussing all the aspects around an application, for example, and deliberating about all the stuff that you just discussed, like the potential biases, the potential issues, the patient populations, the impact. It really, it shows the diversity of the workforce we have, and it shows really how many angles that you really have to consider. Our medical officers, the tasks for them is extremely challenging, and I think they really take into consideration all of that. Now, the other aspect of this is the unknowns about the technology, and I suspect that we may need to start incorporating more and more those who understand the technology more, those who are on the technology side and understand the pitfalls of the technology itself, understand how an algorithm would work and where the pitfall for that algorithm might be. And that's even lend itself to a better collaboration between the Center for Devices and Center for Drugs. And I see that more and more happening. We collaborate with our colleagues at the Center for Devices more and more, since they have the expertise on the engineering side. But I do think we have to keep an eye on how biases, and again, biases already existing in our current clinical trials. And this is something we pay attention to. When a lot of clinical trials are done in specific patient populations in specific regions, what does that really mean for the variety of patients that suffer from the condition that the drug will be used for? So this is something we're familiar with, and I think as we move forward with the incorporation of additional expertise, with the incorporation of better dialogue, we will get there. We will get to a point where we can actually manage those biases, hopefully in an effective manner.
Well, Kara, we could easily keep you on the line a couple more hours, but luckily for you, we can't. We're out of time. I want to thank you. This has been a wonderful presentation, a wonderful discussion. Henry, thank you very much as well. And Susie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Henry and Aaron. That was great. And I also would like to thank everyone in the audience that joined us today. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. The next session of our speaker series will be August 18th, and it's going to feature Dr. Gil Elterovitz, who's the Director of Artificial Intelligence for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So registration is open for that event. So please go ahead and register, and we'd love to virtually see you then. Next, our virtual symposium, a little bit bigger event, 2 afternoons, will be held on September 14th and 15th with keynote addresses from Christine Fox, who is an assistant director here at Johns Hopkins APL and has a very impressive resume and very, very interesting to listen to, as well as Dr. Jim Weinstein, who's the senior vice president of health research from Microsoft. So we're very, very excited about both of those keynote speakers in our September virtual symposium. This event will also include panel discussion and more, and we're accepting poster abstracts. So you'll see a note at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen now with a link to submitting a poster abstract. So I encourage folks to do that as well. A couple little last cleanup items. First, I noticed there was a question to us during the symposium about whether the slides would be available. We don't provide the slides, but we have recorded this session and we'll be sending out a link to everybody who registered. So that will be your mechanism to look at this again and get even more interested in it. And then we'll be sending out a post-event survey, and we ask a favor of you to take a moment to give us your feedback on that survey. We're always hoping to improve and get better and serve the community's needs. So with that, I'm going to thank you again and wish you all a great afternoon.